Yes, Caleb. Caleb Maupin. I know I probably mispronounced his name before we go to him, but he's a real brilliant young man that works for RT, writes. You got to read his articles. I read one of his articles last week about the sanctions in Russia, and he and John Pilger have been all over this. And you read these articles, and he'll tell you where you can get it. And it makes it very clear what the real reason why they have this ongoing Russia investigation, what it's really about, and what the consequences are at this point. Welcome to the show, Caleb.
Sure, glad to be here.
It's great to have you on. Last time I saw you, you and I was working on this documentary with Dave Lugo from A Good American, and he interviewed you in the city. And I saw some of the footage, you and a lot of others that are on it, including Barrett Brown, and you did a great job. And that was the last time that I saw you. But, I became aware of you from one of our regular guests here, Lionel. And Lionel said, you got to see this guy. I mean, he's your biggest supporter, Lionel. And I said, wow. And so I'm on your email list, and people should get on it, or your website, or wherever it is, because your stuff is really profound, brilliant, and prescient. You are with, let me just set you up. You're a correspondent for RT. Let's start there, because you get a lot of, you hear CNN and you hear MSNBC, which is supported by shows like Lockup. Have you seen the show Lockup? And
I have.
Talk about Charlottesville. How could anybody from Howard Fineman to Maddow criticize the president, which I criticize for being so slow here? But that is all based on voyeuristic racism, that show Lockup, which Howard Fineman told me last year that, you know what, look, it's a horrible show, Lenny Wiesenthal type of show, but it underwrites, it pays for Maddow and it pays for Chris Hayes and Chris Matthews and all of the others, but it's really money, it's blood money. It's basically Wages of Sin, and it is the most racist show on all of network television and cable. Do you agree?
Sure. Oh, absolutely. People need to get over this. They say Russian-funded or what it is. Let's be clear, BBC, that's money from the British government. Fox News is partially owned by Saudi Arabia, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. No one calls them Islamic propaganda. People need to get over this. This is just a lot of nonsense. For years, the CIA has been throwing their money around at the media, trying to control the messaging out there. There's all kinds of media all over the world that is supported by all kinds of people, and that this effort to silence independent media, to silence any voice that maybe doesn't say things the way the mainstream does, is something we should all be very, very scared of. Let me say that. But while I'm on this topic, let me make clear.
Go right ahead.
Russia. I'm from Ohio. I'm an Irish American. I grew up in the rural parts of Ohio. I'm a journalist. I do my job. I try to spread the facts. But let's be very clear about one thing. The U.S. government and the U.S. media's hostility to Russia, it's not about homosexuality. It's not about Ukraine. It's not about Crimea. It's about Gazprom and Rosneft. Those are the natural gas and oil companies that are state-owned in Russia. That's what this is about.
This entire investigation, it's basically what you're saying is a ruse or a red herring?
Yes. They can't stand the fact that Russia is a booming oil and natural gas producer, and right now, because of hydraulic fracking, there is more oil and natural gas on the market than ever before in history. And right now, we have a huge amount of oil and natural gas. Oil prices remain low, and the U.S.-based oil companies, the big Wall Street oil conglomerates, Chevron, BP, ExxonMobil, they can't stand the fact that they have a competitor on the world market, that the Russian Federation is exporting on the international markets, and they can't stand it. In the lead-up to these sanctions being passed on Russia, this is actually what was said on the floor by Tim Ryan, a congressman from Ohio. He said, we must continue to focus on how we can get our gas into Europe. And basically at this point, 38% of the European Union's natural gas is imported from Russia. And it's no secret that the government, with their plans for what they call energy dominance, would like them to be buying natural gas from U.S. companies and from the Wall Street-controlled oil companies and natural gas companies, and not from Russia. This is a battle about controlling the markets. It's about keeping Europe and essentially twisting Europe's arm, forcing them to buy oil from the United States and pushing Russia out of the international markets. That's what this is about. This is about profits. In the 1990s, after the Soviet Union collapsed, there was a humanitarian catastrophe in the former Soviet Union. 37 million people who'd been guaranteed a job, guaranteed health care, guaranteed education, were cast into poverty. And there was just an economic disaster. And that was reversed starting in the year 2000, largely by the fact that the Putin administration reasserted public control over the oil and natural gas resources in Russia and used that to stabilize the economy. And that's what's been going on. And ever since then, there has been a continued hostility from the United States. And I must say, who is this star witness that they brought in as he was an expert on Russia? This guy, Bill Browder.
Star witness. Oh, yes.
Outrageous.
Yes.
Nothing more
Wait a second. Back up there.
Who marched at Occupy Wall Street support a hedge fund manager and a guy who's convicted of tax fraud.
Well, wait a second. Let's go back a minute. Now, Bill Browder, he was a star witness. Where now? These are during the debate for. There wasn't much of a debate.
They brought him before the Senate committee, as if he was somehow an expert on Russia. This is a guy. This is an American investor. He actually has British citizenship, but he's U.S. born. And this is somebody who went to Russia in the 1990s and was running hedge funds and was working with HSBC Bank from Britain and British Petroleum. And as Gazprom emerged and was starting to, compete and push these private companies out of the market, and Russia was asserting its own control over its natural gas, this guy started to have a clash with the Russian government. He was convicted of tax fraud. So why are all these people who are so outraged about, the big banks and the bailouts and Wall Street, why are they sticking up for a guy who's a convicted tax cheat and a hedge fund manager? This is ridiculous. I mean, and the whole thing, the whole narrative around Russia is just completely false. And let's be real, it's no secret that in 1996, when Boris Yeltsin was running for re-election, it is actually bragged about that the U.S. did everything they could do to get him re-elected, even though the Russian people were suffering and overwhelmingly did not approve of his neoliberal free market policies. They couldn't stand what was happening. I mean, the collapse of the Soviet Union was a disaster. I mean, people were cast into poverty. You talk about all the sex trafficking and the heroin. The 1990s was a very dark time in the period of that country, and it's been largely reversed by the Putin government, and that's why they can't stand him. Look, and Libya. I mean, look at Libya.
Well, let's stay there before we go to. Wait a second.
Sure.
I want to let's stay there with Putin for a minute, because John Pilger, the internationally renowned, multi-award-winning journalist, has said just that Putin, when he came in, kind of restored pride and made it an independent country again. What was happening during Yeltsin's period of time?
They were essentially, at that time, they were essentially allowing the banks to just go in, the Western corporations, and privatize things. Jeffrey Sachs from Columbia University was presiding over what actually, it's very interesting, Naomi Klein has this book, The Shock Doctrine, and she goes over and documents what the neoliberal institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, and others were doing in Russia during that period. And that was really a disaster. We have this narrative in our head that the collapse of the Soviet Union just brought freedom, and that the 1990s was this glorious, hopeful time in Russian history, and that just doesn't square with the facts. People who visited the country during that time were very aware that it was very much a disaster. Something like 80% of Russian farms went bankrupt during that period. Right at that point, Russia was forced to start buying so much of their agricultural products from the United States. Because their farming system just collapsed. It was a disaster. You had mass unemployment. Sometimes as high as 25% unemployment during that period. It was a disaster. This kind of disaster capitalism that was being imposed on Russia by the Yeltsin administration, cooperating with the Clinton White House. That was cooperating with it. 1996, they worked overtime to try and get him reelected. And that has largely been reversed. And now, with hydraulic fracking, we now have an abundance. At this point, the United States is now the top natural gas producer in the world. For many years, that was Russia. But now it's the United States, because of hydraulic fracking, that has more natural gas than ever before, and the price is going down. There's an abundance of it. And they would like to drive the Russians off the market. Libya, that was a strong oil-exporting country. It's now in ruin. Iraq, another oil-exporting country, selling oil on the international markets. in competition with the U.S. and Wall Street and London corporations. It's been destroyed. Venezuela now is being targeted. You'll notice that there are all kinds of efforts to bring down the Venezuelan government coming from Washington. There's a demonization of the Venezuelan leadership. Well, again, what is Venezuela? It's an independent oil-exporting country. Wall Street doesn't want competitors.
Okay, wait a sec. So you're saying that, and I see it here, that here Europe is a big consumer. They get 38%, I believe, of their gas, natural gas and oil from Russia. And so we want those markets there. We don't want competition. Is that what it is? Besides Venezuela and all of that, Russia, we don't want them to compete. And these sanctions, tell me what these sanctions did to Europe, like especially Germany and France, by taking gas in from the Soviet or from Russia.
Well, these sanctions specifically targeted some key, natural gas pipeline projects, and the Germans were extremely outraged. Some of the loudest outrage against these sanctions came from Germany, and this is essentially the United States strong-arming its so-called allies in Europe, its NATO allies, and telling them, you better buy your natural gas from us. And why would you do that? If you're in Germany and Russia's right there, it's another European country, you can just get your gas from them. But we're essentially trying to strong arm them with economic measures and force them to buy natural gas from U.S. producers. This is economic warfare. This is not about human rights. This is not about Ukraine. This is about Wall Street monopolists trying to keep control and edge their competitors off the market.
And so what would be the natural response in Russia? I mean, you are cutting off their food supply, basically. You're cutting off commodity sales, which is going to bankrupt. You're talking about a nuclear-armed country. Is it boxing them into a corner here?
Well, look, I'm not in Russia. I can't tell you what people on the street are saying. But this is a very scary thing. I mean, all over the world we're seeing a polarization where essentially countries are being, forced. Do you want to trade with Russia and China, or do you want to trade with the United States? And they're not being given the opportunity to get along with everybody. They talk about sanctions. A synonym for sanctions that's often used is economic warfare. That's a term that's often used, and it's essentially it's a way of forcing people and coercing them, and forcing their economy to do certain things and to essentially penalize a country economically, and that's what's being done here. And Russia's economy at this point is centered around their oil and natural gas exports. That's the biggest factor in their economy. So if they're being pushed up against the wall, and they're, people are being threatened and basically being strong-armed out of trading with them, that's not going to lead to good relations. That's not going to lead to good relations at all.
Well, if you look at the public here, if you at the top 10 concerns, mostly economic, Russia doesn't show up, except they keep pushing this narrative about Russia interfering with our election through Guccifer and WikiLeaks and all of this stuff, and that Adam Schiff. You have all of these people, these congressional committees. You got Mueller, who's been discredited for lying about the Iraq weapons of mass destruction in 2002 and 2003. So you've got this narrative. That doesn't seem to really it doesn't scare me. Russia doesn't scare me. I know they had nothing to do. If they did, we have, as you said, we've been involved in 88 overthrows in destabilizing countries, at least. Go to Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, Cuba, Iraq, Libya, all over the world, forever. Going back to Iran in '54, in Guatemala in '54, in Iran in '53 with the Mossadegh, and you go way back and back and back and back. I'm not afraid of the Russians. The Russians have no ambitions to come here. They don't even have a base. I mean, is there a base outside of Russia?
Well, I'll tell you this. This Russiagate investigation is a threat against Donald Trump. I think it's comparable in a lot of ways to right after John F. Kennedy took office, how there was this mass campaign against him with the John Birch Society, all these people saying John F. Kennedy was a Russian agent and he was a traitor and he was an enemy. This is a threat because Donald Trump, throughout his campaign, he said he wanted to put America first. He wanted to stop meddling around the world. He wanted to stop toppling regimes. He appealed to, and that's how millions of Americans feel right now. A lot of Americans, especially.
But there are a lot of reasons why we don't like Trump. The only reason why you could possibly like him is that he was a dove, apparently, with Russia. But, with the mass deportations, Jeff Sessions, the opening up of
Russiagate.
Just the Russia thing.
Trump. This is a threat against him. This is if he's too soft on the Russians, if he's too soft on China, if he's too soft on independent countries, if he doesn't start playing ball with the Pentagon and following the hawkish neocon agenda that very much has power in Washington D.C. If he fights that too much, they've got this on him, and they can accuse him of working with Russia.
Right.
That's what this is about.
Well, why don't they investigate him for the mass deportations, for all of the other things that are going on domestically by Trump with all of these appointments, and why isn't the news concerned about that rather than only Russia? I mean, obviously, it's because they want him. They'll be happy once we finalize this. Is it going to be like a prolonged kind of a Cold War, or could it morph into a hot war?
Well, we can only hope. A hot war would be a disaster for the human race.
Of course it would.
The implications of that are something that we can all picture in our minds, and we wouldn't be alive too much longer. But let's talk about this, because this idea that if we don't like what someone says, we can accuse them of working with the Russians. There's a whole ugly history.
I'm going to get accused of that right now. You know that.
Yeah. Who was accused of that? Martin Luther King Jr., right? They said, oh, he's a Soviet agent. Look, he's trying to create trouble. This is a communist thing, this idea that all people are equal, white and black. That sounds like the Communist Manifesto. This is the kind of stuff that was in the press in the 1950s, right? You can go all through history. For years it was the Republicans that played this card. If the Democrats said they wanted to get out of Vietnam, well, that's because they were working for Moscow. Reagan played this card against his opponents. But now we see the Democrats, which used to be the party that was more sympathetic to the peace movement, have become the more interventionist party. And that in a weird way, we've got many people that are anti-war or anti-interventionist that are leaning toward the Republican side. It's a changing sentiment, but I don't believe that millions of people throughout the Rust Belt and Wisconsin and Michigan and Ohio and the key states, Pennsylvania, I don't think that they voted for Trump because Russia told them to. I think they voted for Trump because they're angry at the political establishment. Yeah, right. And the Democrats nominated somebody who was very much the walking incarnation of the political establishment that everyone is angry with. Hillary Clinton is just exactly what comes to mind if you say the political establishment, the machine that's broken. That's what people think of. And we saw that, the fact that on the Democratic side we had Bernie Sanders, got so much support that even among the Democrats there's anger at the establishment. People all over the United States are unhappy. Wages are dropping. People just, the younger generation are just not going to have the standard of living that their parents had. We're seeing a ramping up of police state repression with government forces. We got the NSA listening to our phones. We got police kicking down doors. We got police brutality. We got all kinds of stuff going on. A lot of people in this country are very upset. And I think the fact that Trump was elected was because people are upset. I don't think it's because Russia conspired to some vast plot. I mean, let's just talk seriously. I mean, who's promoting conspiracy theories here? If you're going to blame the fact that millions and millions of people voted for someone on a foreign country that's on the other side of the world, I mean, who's the conspiracy theorist here?
Right. No, I absolutely. Listen, I am I on here? I am. I must tell you that I wasn't happy. I was a supporter of Bernie Sanders, even though he didn't go far enough for me. He didn't go far enough on foreign policy. He was talking good things about Saudi Arabia's got to help out. And that's another area that we can talk about. Is that I want to talk about. You were talking about Venezuela. We have a few extra minutes here. Venezuela, what's happening there, destabilizing Venezuela. And talking about democracy. Hear this guy Rex Tillerson saying we're gonna bring democracy. We're gonna regime change. In the meantime, what do they care about democracy? We're supporting all these Gulf states. We're supporting Bahrain. We're supporting the most vile nation, as far as I'm concerned, on the planet, and that would be Saudi Arabia. What do you say about that?
Well, I've been to Venezuela. I was there during the elections in 2015. I spoke to a lot of people. And I'll tell you, they say Venezuela is a dictatorship. I saw advertisements bashing the president and bashing the ruling party on television. I saw opposition protesters everywhere not being arrested, not being beaten up. I saw leaflets being passed out. The idea that it's some kind of dictatorship is absurd. But I'll tell you what Venezuela is, and it's a country that has it's an oil country. I mean, it's always been an oil exporting country. That's their main export, and their economy revolves around it. But starting under the government of Hugo Chavez, 1999, they moved toward, using the oil resources for the country. I remember I walked through a neighborhood in Caracas, and the person I was with told me that every house had been built by an interest-free loan that the government had given these people so that they could buy their own homes. And before that, they had lived in shacks without electricity and running water. In Venezuela, the government has been using the oil proceeds to build up the domestic economy. They talk about 21st century socialism or Bolivarianism. And because they're selling their oil on the international markets, competing with Wall Street, they want to smash them. And they don't produce very much food domestically. And these food importing corporations have very much been working with the United States in order to destabilize the country. Shortages are being created, and it's a problem for them. And they're facing hardship. And the question in Venezuela now is, what do they do next? They had a constituent assembly, getting people together, talking about how they can change the way the government is set up to address all of that. But people really need to look at what these forces that are kind of celebrated on U.S. media in Venezuela are actually doing, right? I mean, these forces in Venezuela, they call them heroes. They call them, they say that they're just, freedom fighters fighting for democracy. Look at the kind of things that they're doing. I mean, these are people who string wire across intersections to behead police on motorcycles. These are people who have done some pretty horrendous things. There's video of them, grabbing a black student in Venezuela. They think because he's dark-skinned, he must be for Chavez and he must be for Maduro. And so they pour oil on him, they pour gasoline on him and light him on fire. I mean, there's a section of the Venezuelan opposition. Most people in the Venezuelan opposition are just people that don't agree with this policy or that policy. There's a section of it, a small section of it, among the very wealthy that is very violent and very dangerous, and they get glorified on U.S. TV. They're portrayed as if they're freedom fighters, but they're quite a dangerous bunch. And if you actually investigate the situation in the country, you'll see that extreme faction, that group, that associated with Leopoldo Lopez and others, these are not choir boys. These are not just freedom-loving pacifists. This is quite a violent bunch of folks that are determined to bring down the Venezuelan government by any means necessary. And I mean, there are problems in Venezuela. I was there. People had their frustrations. People that supported the government had their frustrations. People that were critical had their frustrations. But none of them want a civil war. None of them want the country to be destroyed. And that seems to be the question, because there seems to be this radical, and very, very small minority in the country that seems to be committed to resolving the tensions there with violence, and that's something we should all be worried about. I mean, having Venezuela, degenerate into chaos is not something that would be in the interest of anyone, especially not people in this hemisphere.
Well, listen, I got to tell you, we got a lot out of you in 23 minutes, man. I was our guy who's going to talk about Venezuela. You covered that pretty well, and I want to thank you for being on the show. We have to go on, take a station break, and bring on our last guest here. I just want to let people know how they can access your material. Could you lay that out for us?
Well, I'm on RT every day. You can turn on RT. I believe it's on cable here in New York. Or you can check out my website. It's just CALEBMAUPIN.info, calebmaupin.info. That's my website, and I do a lot of writing and journalism, just trying to spread the truth in a world of mainstream media lies.
Well, you're doing a very good job. Thank you. I think you enlightened me a lot on this, and I've learned a lot reading your columns. All right, we're going to play Sam Cooke, Get Out, and